So many of us have heard of or even seen performances from circuses like the Wringling brothers and Barnum and Bailey. But in the early 1900s, one of the top performing circuses is one that you may never have heard of. The Hagenback-Wallace Circus employed around 250 performers, including lion tamers and acrobats. The circus had so many performers, animals, and gear that they had to use two separate trains of nearly 30 cars each to accommodate everyone and everything. Unfortunately, in the summer of 1918, one of the cars carrying many of the circus's performers and workers was crashed into by an empty train, manned by an engineer who had fallen asleep. Over 100 people were injured in the crash and over 80 were killed. This is a brief history of the Hammond Circus Train Wreck. As always, this brief history contains graphic content that may not be suitable for all audiences. Viewer discretion is advised. The Hagenback-Wallace Circus was formed in 1907, when circus owner Benjamin Wallis purchased the circus of Carl Hagenbach. The subsequent joining of the circuses made the Hagenback-Wallace Circus the third largest in the country, with over 250 performers and animals accompanying them on the road. The traveling circus in the early 1900s was a highly sought-after destination for entertainment for the masses. Whenever arriving in a new town, the circus was sure to draw attention. The early 1900s was also known as the golden age of railroads. Railroads which made it easy for a circus to travel from town to town, with less downtime between performances, giving them the ability to perform more shows in more towns. The Hagenback-Wallace Circus had two trains, with nearly 30 cars each to be able to travel with all of their performers, animals, costumes, and gear. In June of 1918, the circus was leaving Michigan City, Indiana, where they had just completed two successful performances. After loading their train cars, they left for their next destination, the nearby Hammond, Indiana, a mere 45 miles away. The first of the circus's two trains, which carried workers of the circus as well as many of the performance animals, sailed easily to Hammond and arrived with no trouble. The second train, however, was having problems with a hotbox aboard the train. If the hotbox issue was not dealt with immediately, the overheated axle bearing could have caused a fire aboard the train, and the engineers made the decision to stop and address the issue. It was early morning, around 4 a.m., when the engineers pulled the train off onto a side track, though the last 5 cars were left parked on the main track. In order to protect the train that was left on the main track, the engineers put up signage for fellow drivers an appropriate distance away and fitted the area with lanterns so they were more easily seen. The performers and workers slept soundly as the train engineers went to work on fixing the problem. While working toward a fix, an empty train that had recently been used to transport soldiers for deployment in the First World War came barreling down the tracks. The driver of the train, engineer Alonzo Sargent, who had fallen asleep at the wheel, was going between 25 and 60 miles an hour. He hurried past multiple stop signals and signs, and finally past the lamps of the desperate circus crew, who could do nothing but watch in horror as the steel-frame train collided with the wooden circus coaches. The sound of the impact was so loud that it traveled to nearby homes, waking up the occupants and bringing townsfolk to the scene of the crash. It was said that one of the coaches buckled on itself so badly that a survivor who had been thrown from the car mentioned that it looked like the coach had been sliced with a giant knife. In the seconds after impact, the kerosene lamps throughout the coaches set the train alight after having been tossed about the cabins. Many of the workers and performers in the train perished upon impact, but there were over 100 people who suffered injuries ranging from major to minor. The survivors with less injuries quickly went to work to save their friends and family members, many endangering their own lives along the way. The fire spread so quickly that while survivors did manage to pull out some of their family and friends, their time was limited, and many of them were unable to be saved from the inferno. The fire departments of both Gary, Indiana and Hammond, Indiana had been called by a witness, and they arrived as quickly as possible. But the only source of water available to quench the fires was a nearby shallow marsh. It took time to put the fire to a manageable point, and the wreckage was significant. After the blaze died down, a wrecking crane was brought to the scene of the crash in order to dig people out, whether they be survivors or the dead. An Iowa newspaper later wrote, "The task of identifying the dead and seriously injured was almost hopeless." Not only were many of the bodies burned so badly that recognition was impossible, but practically everyone on the train was killed or hurt. All in all, the Hagenback-Wallace Circus lost 86 performers to the train wreck that day, including some of their most famed: animal trainer Millie Jewell, Jenny Ward Todd, a member of the Flying Wards, the Strongman brothers Arthur and Joseph Derricks, and the young sons of the circus's chief clown, Joseph Doyle. In addition to the dead, over 100 people were injured in the accident. It was hard to place blame on any one person or company in the incident, and it seemed like there was just a perfect storm of problems on the night of the wreck. Was it the railway company's fault? The fault of the man who fell asleep? The fault of the circus company for leaving cars on the main track? Or perhaps even that the circus company hadn't yet upgraded its wooden cars to something safer and sturdier. Despite the tragedy and loss of lives, family, and friends, as they say, the show must go on. The remaining members of the circus knew they had to go on performing and only missed 2 shows, thanks to circuses across the nation providing them with equipment and crew to replace what had been lost. After the crash, the deceased performers were buried in a large plot in Chicago at Woodlawn Cemetery called Showman's Rest. Out of the 53 plots at Woodlawn, only 5 have their graves marked, including Baldy, Smiley, and Four Horse Driver, nicknames used by the performers. The rest of the dead were too badly burnt to be identified. Their graves at Woodlawn were memorialized with a large stone elephant, with its trunk drooping in sadness. The cemetery is still open and able to be visited today. Each year, as part of the annual Clown Week festivities, Woodlawn hosts a memorial gathering at Showman's Rest. The participants in the event come to the ceremony dressed as clowns and switch between sadness and humor throughout the day. All in all, the Hammond Circus Train Wreck was one of the worst train wrecks in history, and many performers gave their lives in pursuit of entertaining the masses. I hope you enjoyed this episode of A Brief History. Thank you to my patrons who support this series, it is much appreciated. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and I'll see you next time.